Hello and welcome to this sewing tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how you can easily sew the sewing pattern twist shirt step by step at home. Here is an overview of the different models available. There is 3 different lengths for each of the 2 sleeve variations: cropped, slightly cropped and regular. You can also refer to written instructions which list the front lengths for each model and size. There you will also find a cutting plan for all the sizes you want to cut and further informations on cutting. That's why I'm leaving that out here a bit. However, I will show you which pattern pieces you will definitely need depending on the model. In any case, you will always need the front and back pieces as well as a matching neckband depending on the fabric you have chosen. If you are sewing the long version with long sleeves, you will need one right and one left sleeve in the long length and 4 ribbons. And if you're sewing the short sleeve version, you'll need 2 short sleeves instead of the long sleeve and ribbon. You can pause here for a moment, then you can see which notches you should have marked so that you don't forget anything. And here I have a little preview of a few different versions for you, showing what they look like when they're finished. And then we can start by joining the shoulder seams. To do this, I laid the back piece in front of me. You can always recognize the back piece that the neckline is less deep than the front piece. And now I lay the 2 pieces right sides together with the nice sides, so the right side facing each other. And then I pin the shoulder seams together. I'm using clips here simply because it makes it easier for you to see, but of course you can also use pins. One very important thing: today we're closing all our seams with a seam allowance of 7 millimeters. Next, lay the 4 strips from the ribbons in front of you and fold them in half lengthwise, right sides together, and pin the long side together a little so that you can sew the open edges together straight away. Now let's prepare the neckband piece and pin the short sides together, right sides facing, so that we can join them together to form a little circle. I'm sewing here in my overlock machine. If you don't have an overlock machine, you can use your normal household domestic sewing machine. It's important that you use an elastic stitch in each case. Most machines have a triple straight stitch, for example, that basically looks like a normal straight stitch, but it goes always back and forth so that it remains elastic. Here you can see what the finished pieces look like after sewing. These are the 4 ribbons for the long versions and the neckband. We now need to turn the bands for the sleeves inside out so that we can iron them straight away. Now has the seam on the inside, which you need to move slightly to one side so that it is not twisted and in a weird way. Then I simply lay it down so that it is roughly in the middle. You don't necessarily have to measure this. I think a visual estimate is sufficient. Of course, you can measure it if you want to. And then I just iron it smooth so that the seam can be nice on the back side later. In the neckband, I now simply iron the seam allowance to one side. It doesn't really matter which side, just make sure it lies nicely later on. Here we can see the torso, so the front and back, where we have just joined the shoulder seams. Now we need to iron the seam allowance on the shoulder into the back. Next, we sew the sleeves into the armholes. These are still open, so only the shoulder seams are connected. And now I get the matching sleeves. I simply look to see where the front sleeve insert point is. So front arm point, of course, it has to go on the notches in the front piece, but right sides facing. I start here at the shoulder and pin the whole thing together, followed by the notches in the front and back and the sides, and afterwards I just pin everything that is in between, that everything is connected with each other. Just work your way through step by step and nothing can go wrong. And of course we repeat the same thing on the other side so that we can sew everything together at once. This time I first pinned the shoulder seams, then the notches, and then the side directly. Just to show you that it also works in another order, but as I said, you can do it however you want. The main thing is that everything is pinned together at the end. Just work your way through. And the whole thing almost looked like a top. Yay! There's another tip for sewing. I always put the needle out just before I sew over them. This is especially important for an overlocker, as you should never sew over pins. That's why I like to use clips here. That way it's not that easy to sew over them. Now we're going to iron the sleeve we have just inserted. To do this, we iron the seam allowance into the sleeve, so away from the shoulder and away from our torso. Of course, we do this on both sides, on both sleeves. Here I show you how you can make it a little easier with a sleeve ironing board if you have one at home. I find it a bit more comfortable when the sleeve itself is positioned a little higher. It just lays a little nicer. Here are the ribbons for our long version. We've ironed them nicely and now we'll place them on one of the sides, one on top of the other, so that the notch, which is roughly in the middle of the lower sleeve seam, is exactly between the two ribbons. Then I pin it securely to the side so that nothing slips. When we fold the upper band over the band underneath, then we fold the upper band over the band underneath so that they are now crossed, and pin the whole thing on the other side just as we did on the first side, so that the notch is again exactly between the bands, and now we pin the whole thing in place again so that nothing slips. Then I secure the whole thing with a basting stitch to make it a little easier to sew without everything slipping. This is quick to do, and believe me, it really takes much longer to unpick it all again. The important thing is to use a smaller seam allowance than you will use later, just very close to the edge, around 5 millimeters. Now we pin the side seam and the lower sleeve seams together. To do this, we place the front and back pieces right sides together. We pin the side seams together, so the side seam of the front piece and the side seam of the back piece on both sides, and then continuously pin the lower sleeve seams together, where we just pin the ribbons, which are now lying exactly on top of each other. Then we sew everything together in one go. Of course, we do this on both sides again. At the sleeve seam, where the torso and sleeves were sewn together, you should now make sure that the seam allowance remains in the direction in which you just ironed it so that nothing twists. Now we come to the neckline. First we prepare our cuff. We fold the cuff, so the neckband that we have already sewn together and ironed in half, left sides together. The left side is on the inside and the two right sides, so nice sides, are on the outside. I pin it together with a few pins so that nothing slips. The seam in the center back is exactly aligned. Before we sew it, I pin it to the neckline at the center front and center back to check that it fits. It's always a bit difficult to give general information about neckbands. I've included 2 pattern pieces to the pattern, one for ribbing fabric and one for jersey, but jersey fabric can just vary quite a bit in terms of stretch and properties, so it's difficult to say that it will really work for every jersey fabric you'll find out there. That's why I would recommend checking whether it's possible to stretch the whole thing to the width of the neckline. If that's not possible, then unfortunately you'll have to cut out another neckband that is longer by the length that you're missing. It fits for me now, so I'm going to pin it in place. I'm pinning the seam at the center back of the neckband to the knot at the center back of the back piece, the knots at the side to the shoulder seams, and the knots at the center front to each other. And then pull the neckband, but only the neckband, so the pattern piece that we are currently sewing on. This needs to be stretched to the length of the neckline, but never stretch both at the same time, or in general never stretch the neckline, because then you'll get to see slightly puckers at the neckline, and we don't want that. So just work your way along slowly, bit by bit, and it should definitely work out. And at the end, I simply sew over the beginning again with the overlock machine to secure the whole thing to prevent it from coming apart later, because it is really a stress area. You can then secure the end of the overlock seam. Personally, I always sew the end by simply locking. You can do it however you usually do it. If you have an overlocking machine, you may already have found the method that works best for you. Here you can see what the neckline should look like once it has been sewn in. Of course, we'll iron it again now. I'll use my sleeve ironing board again. You can also do this on a normal ironing board, simply on the narrow side at the front. The seam allowance is now ironed into the body away from the neckline. This will probably fall into place by itself. Now I pull it a little so that I don't iron any creases in, but so that everything is nice and smooth. And now I iron all the way around until everything is nice and flat. We now iron the side seam and the lower sleeve seam in the same way. The seam allowance goes into the back piece or the back sleeve, always away from the front piece. To iron the sleeve, I now use the sleeve ironing board again, iron out the seam allowance. This applies to both versions regarding of whether you have the long or short sleeves. The seam allowance are always ironed into the back, so away from the front, and on the sleeves also towards the back. For the long version, make sure you move the ribbon underneath a little so that you don't iron them together in an unattractive way. Then turn the whole thing over. It may happen that the ribbons are now outside of the sleeves. Then simply turn the whole thing over and pull the sleeve through once, as I show here. While we're ironing, let's iron the hem allowance in the sleeve and torso once. The hem allowance is 4 cm in the sleeve and 3 cm in the torso. I use the tape measure to measure everything out nicely, bit by bit. Traditionally with jersey, the hem is not a serge, but simply cut and stitch, because with thinner fabric in particular, you can see the seam through, which looks unattractive and it becomes a little thick. Jersey doesn't actually fray, so you don't need to serge it. If you feel uncomfortable with it, you can also do it with thicker fabrics, but I wouldn't recommend it for classic jersey. Now let's stitch our hem from the right side. You can use the stitch that your sewing machine offers. If you have a twin needle or even a cover lock machine, you're welcome to use it. I'm stitching it here with a distance of 3 cm for the hem edge of the sleeve and 2 cm from the hem of the torso all around. If you want, you can also add a second seam. If you have chosen a straight seam, then you can also get this effect with like a twin needle or cover lock. If not, you can also carefully cut away the excess seam allowance at the back if it bothers you, but you don't really have to. If you want, you can now at the end top stitch the neckline again close to the edge. To do this, simply stitch with an elastic stitch, for example triple straight stitch around the edge at a distance of 3 mm or 2 to 3 mm. And that's it for my tutorial on our twist shirt. I hope everything went well for you and that you had fun. If you have any questions, feel free to write to me in the comments or message me on Etsy, Instagram, or whatever. I always try to respond to your messages. If you like the pattern, please feel free to leave me a review on Etsy. But of course, you're also welcome to leave a thumbs up here, and see you next time.